Testing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Test, test. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Test, test. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Mic check. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Yes. I'm actually quite excited that I did this forget to be an interesting combination. I hope it has, you know, it hits the That was so funny. It's a good photo. No, it was a great photo. Although this is a media company, so they don't want the rest. Yeah, so this although to be honest, I was watching the stream of it. They were a 3D camera. I can yeah, something like that. What brings you to the Yeah, these two firms. So this SI Social Impact Capital. It's the only VC fund in the world organized around the and they're going to publicize. So we right now at 50 million for fund one. That was close to fund two. By coastal San Francisco. So I think so. I think so. Yeah. I don't think you will remember. I do. So I have your card. This is my
Check. Oh, there we go.
Can everybody please take a seat? And the panelists should go on stage. No? You got the best seat in the house there. Oops, sorry. So, good afternoon. For those I haven't met, my name is Andy Brown. I'm the editorial director of the Bloomberg New Economy. Welcome to this special edition of the Editors Discussion Series. We say it's special for a number of reasons. The first reason is this is the first event of its kind that we've done as a collaboration, and our partner is here today, the Asia Society, the Northern California branch. A big shout out to Margaret Conley, who's just done a brilliant job helping us put this event together. Thank you, Margaret. It's also special because this is the first time we've done this as a televised event. We've done lunches, we've done dinners, we've done panels, but we've never had cameras rolling while we've done it. So the third reason it's special, obviously, is because we have an amazing group of panelists. I won't introduce you all because Emily is going to do that when the cameras start rolling. Emily Chang, tech anchor for Bloomberg TV here in San Francisco. And it's also special because of the audience. I think everybody in this audience, any one of you could hold your own up here on the stage collectively. You've got enormous amounts of experience in technology, in science, in business, in finance, and so on. So thank you very much for being here. Just very briefly, before I hand over to Emily, the running order is as follows. The panel will take about 30, 40 minutes. Then we hand over to the audience for Q&A. And that should take us to about 5:15, at which point, as I was saying to Joy, we have to take a collective decision. What is more important, the US-China technology Cold War or gin and tonic? I know what the answer is to that question, but we'll decide when the time comes. With that, thank you, Emily. I'll hand over to you.
Some technical difficulties in the TV production, but maybe Andy, you could tell us a little bit more about the New Economy Forum and the objectives and what you pulled off last year.
Sure. So the New Economy Forum was set up by Michael Bloomberg. His vision was that, the whole premise of the New Economy Forum is that the center of gravity of the global economy is shifting from north to south and from west to east, and it's giving rise to all sorts of tensions and conflicts. And so we need a new forum to hash out some of these issues in a non-confrontational way and in a part of the world that is actually new economy, China. So we define new economy, by the way, as being rising powers, China, India, as well as Middle East, Africa, Latin America, as well as new emerging technologies and the interplay between the two. So we were supposed to have had our inaugural event last year in Beijing, but unfortunately we were, how do I put this politely, diverted by the trade war. The dates coincided with the Shanghai Import Expo, which was considered to be the more important of the events. And so we ended up in Singapore. Wang Qishan actually got on a plane and flew down to see us for dinner and made a very good speech. This year, we're back. We're in Beijing, November 20 to 22nd. We've got a lot of high-level supports. We have 500 CEOs from all over the world. It's CEO only, and our topics, as well as technology, include trade, investment, finance, and of course climate change, given that this is a Mike Bloomberg event. And then around that conference, we organize a series of events, this being one of them, plus we're building out a media platform. It's a really important part of Bloomberg and Bloomberg Media.
This is what we do before the cameras start rolling, just so you know.
You cut this part out.
Yeah. We're close.
This broadcast, by the way, on Friday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time. Oh, yeah. Kelly, who's the real TV person here, reminds me that I should remind you that you should turn your phones off.
Do you need to do a test? Good? Okay. All right. So first of all, everyone, thank you so much for coming. Appreciate you being here on this Tuesday afternoon. I'm so excited to be interviewing such a distinguished group of people at such an exciting time. I mean, gosh, even just the last 24 hours have been quite eventful on this topic. So I'd like to welcome Sam Sachs, cybersecurity expert and fellow at New America, Susan Shirk, chair of 21st Century China Center and a professor at the University of California, San Diego, and Joy Tan, senior vice president for public affairs at Huawei, as well as Ken Wilcox of the Asia Society and chairman of Silicon Valley Bank. So in the last 24 to 48 hours, we've had a new set of tariffs. We've had China stopping buying agricultural products from the United States. We've got the president calling China a currency manipulator. So I wanted to start with a question for all of you, which is, are we at war with China? Ken?
I don't think so. And I don't think we're at war, because when I think about the word war, I think of actual hot war.
But we use the term trade war all the time.
We do that. I think we're just having some conflicts. It's a question of having yet to figure out how we're going to work with each other effectively. But I would not call this war.
Sam, just some conflicts?
There are some deeper structural factors at play that I think it's important, before we get wrapped up in the headlines from the last few days, just to back up and say, over the past year and a half or so, we've been seeing what I think of as a perfect storm in Washington and Beijing. So in Washington, you've had an overhaul of CFIUS, the review of investments into the United States. You've had an overhaul of the export control regime. You've had more scrutiny on Chinese researchers and sciences, and just a broader pressure to unwind supply chains from China. On the Chinese side, you have a government under Xi Jinping that is doubling down on reducing reliance on foreign technology suppliers, creating what I think is one of the most comprehensive regulatory regimes for the digital economy in the world. So let's not just get focused on the headline risk. These are structural factors which I think are creating an enormous amount of tension. Then you throw into the mix a global campaign to take down Huawei. And this is where we are.
Huawei is, Joy, at the center of the storm. Of course, it's been blacklisted by the Trump administration. Many US companies have had to cut off supplies to Huawei. You previously worked in previous affairs, and now you're lobbying for Huawei in Washington, which I imagine isn't the easiest of jobs. What is that like these days?
Well, we definitely want to have a productive conversation with the U.S. government, but we're actually not getting a lot of meetings. So it's a challenge for us. We definitely want to understand the government's concerns and create some kind of framework that can alleviate those concerns and build safe and secure networks for the U.S. operators and their consumers.
So how about this? Would you say we're in a tech Cold War?
Yes,
Why?
I would say we are. I mean, a lot of people would note that this Cold War is very different from the US-Soviet Cold War because the Soviet Union and the United States had very few economic or technological ties during the first Cold War. But in this Cold War, the two countries are already so intertwined. And now each of them is using that interdependence to create leverage on the other in a way that is a kind of aggressive bargaining, perhaps, but the consequences of it could be really disastrous.
The battleground seems to change by the day, Sam. Where do you think this is going?
In the near term, there's a looming deadline, which is August 19th, which is when the temporary general licenses granted to Huawei suppliers will be up for renewal. And I think that's a critical window because a lot of this really is going to hinge on, is there going to be a Huawei deal or not? I think that's a major factor. But it's not all about that, right? It gets back to these structural issues that I've said. I've had conversations with many different companies and policymakers on both sides of the Pacific, and the question that people keep coming back to is, what is the end game of the Trump administration? Is the end game simply a decoupling, a creating two different technology systems? I think for some, that is the end game, right? It may not be just creating a level playing field, and that's where it can be quite dangerous.
So Joy, do you have any indications? Is there going to be a deal for Huawei or not?
We don't know. We certainly hope this situation can be resolved at a timely manner because it's important for Huawei and a lot of our U.S. suppliers. Huawei procures $11 billion each year from U.S. suppliers, and their businesses are being impacted, not just large telecom, not just like companies like Intel or Qualcomm, but small and medium-sized companies as well.
So look, the central question here, the central concern of the United States and the Trump administration is the national security of this country. Can you assure us that Huawei's equipment won't be used for espionage? Can you assure us that you're not infiltrated by the Chinese government?
Huawei has been in the business for the last 30 years, and we work with 500 operators around the world, and 46 out of the top 50 operators around the world, except the several ones here in the US. And we work with 200 out of the Fortune 500 companies. On a daily basis, our networks support over 3 billion people. We never had a single major security incident. So we have a proven track record. And we actually open ourselves up for testing in the UK, in Germany, in Canada. And all these governments are satisfied with our products and solutions. So there's a proven mechanism that can work.
Emily, can I jump in there? Because I would argue, I think there is national security risk from Huawei, but I think that the answer is not, let's dismantle the company. And I think that there are a number of different risks that are often confused. And if we're going to come up with a solution, we can't muddy those risks. And I want to just sort of lay out what those are, because I think there's a lot of confusion around it. So one thing that's often talked about is Huawei gear has lots of vulnerabilities, right? This has been documented from the UK, from the Cybersecurity Evaluation Center. It comes up a lot in the media. The problem is every provider has vulnerabilities, and we don't have similar data on Huawei's competitors. There's a difference between a vulnerability, which is sort of inherent in this sector, and an intentional backdoor. And that is what there has been no evidence found of, right? And I think the resistance from European governments has said, look, you're setting a very dangerous precedent, saying just on the say-so of the US, let's kill this company. But the US government has said, you know what, it doesn't matter that there's not a public smoking gun or a classified smoking gun, because the risk is, in a sort of crisis scenario, what could the company be compelled upon by the Chinese government to do? And here, we don't really know the answer to that, but what, there is a sort of concept of network resilience, right, where regardless of the vendor, you assume bad actors trying to get access into the system unauthorized, and you create a sort of network resilience of layers of security that are meant to handle that. So I like to think of it as kind of a Rorschach test. The risk of Huawei really is more of a reflection of how do you see China, how do you see the Chinese government, and that's why you're seeing the same people looking, the same data sets around the world, but people coming up with wildly different interpretations of that data.
Well, and let's talk about some of what has been reported, and sorry, Joy, you're going to get all the tough questions. But that Huawei worked with a Chinese state-owned company to build a wireless network in North Korea, that partnership, in fact, went on for years. What can you say to convince us, to convince the United States government that the Chinese government doesn't have a backdoor into your company when they work with other private tech companies across China?
Well, first of all, Huawei is a private company. It is owned by its employees 100%. And the Chinese government doesn't have any ownership in Huawei. And it doesn't interfere with Huawei's business operation in any way. And for the last 30 years, Chinese government has not asked Huawei to engage in any behavior that will violate our customers' trust. And I think there's a misunderstanding that Huawei can be manipulated by the Chinese government, but it's absolutely not true. Our founder actually said if we get a request from the Chinese government, we'll close down the company instead of violating our customers' trust.
But the problem is that the Chinese state is too powerful, and it can instruct any private company to do its bidding. So I think Huawei is suffering the consequences of that. It's become a symbol of China, and it's pretty much impossible for any private company in China to say no to Beijing.
Can you respond to that, Joy? And then can you respond to
Well,
that?
I think our founder already said that, and to many media during the interviews, he said if he gets that request from the Chinese government, he would rather close down the company.
Ken.
I'm skeptical, and I'm skeptical because in my experience in China, the distinction between private companies and public companies is largely a fiction. I think it's a question of the Chinese government utilizing our terminology, the distinction between private and public, in order to, in a sense, mislead us a little bit. I believe that functionally, if a private company becomes large enough, it's functionally going to resemble in many, many ways an SOE. And I would also say that that's increasingly true under the Xi Jinping administration, because Xi Jinping has put a lot of emphasis in these last 3 or 4 years on increasing the frequency as well as the influence of party committees in private companies. So it wasn't that long ago that there were a lot of private companies that were small enough anyway that didn't have party committees. But I think that today, even among relatively small companies, about 90% today have party committees. And I do believe that party committees exert influence. I'm not sure how, but I was told at one point in time that our joint venture in China would have a party committee, and that I would never know who was on it or what they decided, because it was all going to be secret. And if that's the case, I could believe almost anything, couldn't I?
So that's
Well,
the
let me,
contradiction.
I can clarify the party committee. I think it is required by Chinese law for the businesses to have party committees. I think Walmart, Ford, they all have, their operation in China have party committees as well. At Huawei, they do not make business decisions. They basically manage employees' welfare, and they organize a lot of travel. Just make sure the employee have a good environment and to live and work.
So here's a question: does the White House have a point? Can the U.S. protect national security and continue to have a strong relationship with China?
I think it can. It really depends on how we define the domain of national security. Former Secretary of Defense Robert Gates, in talking about export controls, he said what you want is a small yard and high fence. Okay, small yard means not every advanced technology. It wouldn't include, for example, advanced manufacturing necessarily. It wouldn't necessarily include biotech and development of cancer drugs. It wouldn't include all of AI necessarily. So you have to, I think, have a more limited definition of the technologies that China's developing through various indigenous efforts and through trying to get advanced technologies from the rest of the world, the ones that are going directly into making the People's Liberation Army and the Chinese military more capable. But if you don't put some boundaries and have a small yard, then basically we're engaged in technological protectionism, technological containment of China, and definitely the folks in China, that's the way they see this. They think that we're just doing everything we can to slow them down, to slow down their progress in order to maintain our own superior position.
Is that what we're doing?
So I love this idea of small yard, high fence. And one of the problems, I've spent some time looking at the overhaul of the export control regime because I think that's where a lot of these tools are at play. The problem is we're obsessed with lists right now. And lists, I don't think, are going to be the best way to go about it, right? So Commerce put out this list last November, a list of emerging technologies that would be subject to new export controls. And I think they were really disappointed because they didn't get a black and white answer when they asked industry, well, which of these is vital to national security? How do you put export controls around AI when a lot of these things, they don't map neatly onto national borders, one, and not all of these have even been developed yet because the list is basically saying, can we evaluate technologies into the future and what they will mean for national security? So I testified before Congress this spring and I suggested that instead of having a list, let's come up with a set of principles and a framework, right? So there are certain things you can think about when we talk about technologies that are vital to the military, for example. I would say, okay, well, let's think about what's not just used by the military, but essential, right? Or where is there a scarcity of knowledge on this technology where the U.S. truly has a cutting edge? Otherwise, you lead to this designing out of U.S. products, right? So there's more of a process and a framework, and I think that the Trump administration, through this new export control process, is trying to create a list framework that just isn't going to be coherent when we think about emerging technologies today.
Aren't they struggling with this? Because we're supposed to get the final list this summer, right?
And then there's and then there's a new list of foundational technologies, and this gets into an even more
sprawl.
Right,
it's sprawling out,
and it gets into this even more complex topic: is how do we think about things like basic research and AI, which is a lot of it done by diffuse networks of engineers and researchers around the world, then published openly online, right? So how do you think about that area?
Well, and Susan, you're on the front lines of what's happening in research and what's happening in universities, and what is happening? How is this impacting talent?
Well, so far, the impact is limited, but there's a lot of anticipatory trying to make sure that Chinese students and visiting scholars are not in your laboratory, even though they want the talent. But if NIH or Department of Energy or the FBI is going to come to you and say that this, even though it's fundamental research, even though most of it is published right away, there's no classified research that goes on most university campuses, certainly not at UC San Diego. Even so, people, just like investors or business people, are dealing with this uncertainty by already kind of separating. I think that's happening on campuses as well.
So hang on, you're saying that at universities, universities are proactively.
No, not the administration. I'm saying individual scientists. So yesterday, in preparation for our conversation today, I talked to one of our senior administrators who leads research at UC San Diego, and she said that quite a few faculty are, very nervous about this because they see that there has been a certain amount of new rules and restrictions from federal agencies so far, but they've been warned by their federal funders, and most of the research money at UC San Diego comes from the federal government as very large amounts. So they are anticipating that there will be more of this coming down the road, and they're quite nervous. They rely heavily on talented PhD students and postdocs from China. And yet they're really worried that they could lose their federal grants if they have talented Chinese working in their laboratories.
There are definitely two significant dangers that are emanating from the situation in which we find ourselves today. I'm speaking now from my experience at some of the universities right here in California, some of the major research institutions. One is the fear factor that you're referring to. And I'm talking about fear factor at the individual level. Individual researchers, individual scientists at some of our most significant universities now are living in fear that something is going to happen. They don't know exactly what that's going to be, but they feel that something is coming in their direction. And I think it's causing some of them to rethink whether they not want to stay or whether they want to perhaps...
You're talking about Chinese Americans.
Chinese Americans, or Chinese Americans, it's Chinese that have lived here for a long time. It's hard to say whether they're Chinese or Americans, but they're doing a good job at the university.
No, they're Americans, but they're Americans of Chinese descent.
Yeah, I take issue with that because I'm not sure that the distinction is going to be helpful to us. Meaning,
well, you either have a U.S. passport or you don't, or maybe you're here on a visa.
Right, but there are definitely people with a U.S. passport who have a keen sense of being Chinese, and there are definitely people who fit into other categories. I think those categories mislead us a little bit, but I still think that the fear factor is going to cause us to lose talent. And the other issue that's happening is that it's causing a significant backlash in terms of public sentiment among Chinese Americans, to use the term, so that I think a lot of Chinese people that came from China and have American passports that have lived here for a long, long time are rethinking how comfortable they are. And I think it would be much better if we were to take a step back and ask ourselves, what's the big picture? And from a big picture point of view, let's say in point of fact that there was some espionage, which I have no doubt probably takes place, but it probably takes place among scientists with various types of passports. If we focus on that and we decide that we want to pursue this in the way the Trump administration wants to, the risk to the U.S. is probably far greater than the risk that we're undertaking in the current situation where there is some modicum level of so-called espionage.
Joy, what are the downstream effects in China? What's the impact there on academic institutions on research on science?
I can't speak too much about the impact on the Chinese universities, but I know for the US universities, a lot of our partners actually are a little bit concerned. And like many other large global companies, Microsoft, Google, they invest and they collaborate with universities, and Huawei does the same. And we invest about $300 million each year to work with universities around the world. And I want to go back to the technology point that Sam was talking about. Actually, when we talk about new technologies, 5G, AI, IoT, cloud, and we're dealing with very new technologies, we have to look at the cybersecurity issue from a technology perspective. If you think about 5G, it actually integrated or corrected the shortcomings of 3G, 4G. And during the standardization process, all these scientists and engineers have built a process and standards. So it uses 256 bits encryption. And it will take a supercomputer 1 million years to crack that encryption. And the code of the encryption is with the operators. So there are standards built into the technology. I think we should have universal objective standards like that to look at the cybersecurity issue and to look at the vendors.
So you make the important point. Huawei is the global leader in 5G. There is no comparison. And should the rest of the world fear that?
Well, there are other companies like Nokia, Ericsson, they have been investing in 5G as well. Huawei is the leader because Huawei has been working in 5G for the last 10 years, and Huawei spent over $2 billion into the 5G research.
Right, but Sam, like, should we fear that? Should not just the United States, but Europe and Australia, all of these different countries and continents where they're considering whether to use Huawei at all, be concerned about Huawei, incorporating Huawei into their networks, and then also concerned that there's not a viable alternative yet?
As I mentioned before, I think that different governments are going to have a different response to that risk spectrum that I laid out. So if you are less concerned about espionage or a crisis with China, if you're in Eastern Europe or you're in parts of Africa, you're going to probably put in place less risk mitigation measures around that. On the other end of the side, you're going to have Australia with a full ban. Then you're going to have the UK model, which has said, look, let's keep Huawei out of the critical network and let's evaluate what is on that network. So I think we're going to have a spectrum of responses because, as I said, the risk really depends on how do you view the Chinese government and China. There's no clear answer to that.
Yeah, and the United States shouldn't assume that the way we look at it is going to be shared by other countries. We see that right now, and I think the Trump administration made a big mistake by going on this big, public, open campaign to try to convince other countries to exclude Huawei from their infrastructure, from their system. And clearly, even in Europe, they didn't get some of our closest allies on board with us. So, in a way, it just reveals that American leverage is not what it used to be.
Ken, question. So many folks might dismiss the administration's strategy here as a lot of bravado and bluster, but does the White House have a point?
Well, of course the White House has a point. There's no doubt about that. But if you reside on our part of the spectrum, I think that was your terminology, Sam, limitations and prohibitions are ultimately going to fail.
Yeah.
It's very, very difficult to contain technology. It, after all, is an abstraction. It crosses borders, it crosses walls. There is no viable containment. The answer from the US point of view, to the extent that we're genuinely worried, and I think we should be, is A, investing, because we should be spending a lot more money on R&D. That's number one. And number two, taking the opposite stance that we seem to be taking toward foreign researchers at our universities today. We should be making them feel more welcome.
For sure.
And we should be doing our absolute best to attract more, because a high percentage of the progress that's been made on the technological front in the US, and particularly in Silicon Valley in these past 30 years, has been driven by people that were born in other countries, notably Asian countries, notably China and India, but others as well.
So I couldn't agree with you more. And what I see is that the United States is in a kind of race to the bottom with China. And we're taking these sort of exclusionary approaches rather than self-strengthening. And I am somewhat encouraged that some of the Democratic candidates for president are talking about the need for self-strengthening, need for investment in research, higher education, in our own infrastructure, which is embarrassingly decrepit. And in so many ways, America has a lot of challenges right here at home. But putting all of this energy into trying to build walls instead of trying to strengthen ourselves by becoming a better version of our open system. I mean, our open science, open innovation, open economy, market economy, is really the strength of America.
And yet that is not the path that we appear to be on under the current administration. If the Silicon Curtain keeps falling, Sam, what are the consequences?
So I think when we look at the consequences, a lot of the time the discussion is, what are the costs to China? What are the costs to the US? But what's missing from the discussion is, and I spend time focusing on technology, what are the costs to humanity, right? And a lot of this transcends US and China. We're talking about technologies that are going to fundamentally alter human society and pose grave risks, to my 6-year-old and 3-year-old. When their generation is going to face new questions around what is human, what is machine, how do we think about, biological engineering, and these are questions that if we end up down this path, I think it's going to be even more dangerous, right? Now, there are really hard questions that have to be had, though, right? There are ways that technology is being used in China today that are deeply troubling. Let's talk about the use of AI in Xinjiang, to facial recognition of Muslim minorities. But at the same time, you also have Chinese thought leaders thinking about things like AI safety and ethics in ways that I think is missing from the conversation here. It's both, and we have to hold both of those things at the same time in order to understand the whole picture. So the conversation has to be clear-eyed about that with an understanding of the risks to humanity if we keep going down this way.
Ken, how is this impacting cross-border investment? Ken, how is this impacting cross-border investment?
Well, we know that right now, cross-border investments relative to just a couple of years ago are at a relative low. There's no doubt about that. And I don't see that changing in the foreseeable future. I do think, however, it's important to spend some time thinking about what's happened in these past few years. What's the pattern of cross-border investments been, and how would we interpret that? And I say that because a lot of the people that I talk to in China, friends and acquaintances alike, think that we as Americans, on average, wake up every morning trying to figure out how to keep China down. And I actually think that that's a misinterpretation. I don't think that most people in the US are trying to keep China down. I think that it's human nature that most people wake up every morning trying to figure out how to protect themselves, not trying to figure out how to keep somebody else down. But I think the anti-Chinese sentiment that we see among the US populace today has a number of different sources, and we could go into all of them. There's a wide list, some of them accurate and deserve, some of them less so. But I think one of the big issues is the suddenness with which Chinese investment in American technology rose up seemingly out of nowhere and and without any forewarning or way of explaining to ourselves what it was all about. So if you look back over the years, I think the first major investment in U.S. technology was 2005. That was Lenovo's purchase of IBM PC business. But nothing of any significance was happening for years and years and years. And even up until 2010 or 2011 or so, the level of Chinese investment in technology in the U.S. was in the single digits in terms of billions. And then all of a sudden, right on the heels of the Xi Jinping announcement of the China Dream, followed by Made in China 2025, suddenly we saw a huge increase. And I myself was astounded because I returned from my years in China at the end of 11, 12, 13, 14. And so I was here the whole time in 15. And I was utterly amazed up until the beginning of 15, the end of 14. I had barely ever seen a Chinese investor in Silicon Valley. Tons of Chinese engineers, but almost never an investor. And I spent years in China trying to coax investors into coming over, and with almost no success. So all of a sudden in 2015, I was getting calls as the retired CEO of Silicon Valley Bank. I was getting calls from SOEs and from so-called private investors, right and left. And I started, but largely because I was curious, not because I was actually intending to do much. I'm retired after all. So I started taking these calls and meeting with people. And I was utterly amazed. First of all, there were people arriving that knew nothing about technology in the US and were saying, help me buy technology. Wow. And I was saying, what do you want to buy? And they'd say, we don't care, just technology. And I'd say, what form do you want to buy it in? We don't care, any access that you could provide. And then when you tried to push them a little, it was largely AI, semiconductors, robotics, and a few other things, supercomputing.
Well, it's all these venture funds that the Chinese government was actually creating, including a lot of local ones. And there was clearly a government policy to encourage this.
Oh, it's
and
like
and a lot of it, and a lot of it. I mean, not all of it was coordinated, but a lot of it was government money, for sure, and massive amounts of money.
But that's not happening now.
No, it's dissipating significantly. But to your point, Susan, one of my friends, Chinese, was telling me that she was involved in a private equity firm that was funded 100% by Beijing, $15 billion so far at that point, and it had one purpose and one purpose only: buy anything American with the word semiconductor in the title. And so if you have spent years and years in the tech community in Silicon Valley and you've never seen a Chinese investor, then all of a sudden in 2015, plane loads seem to be arriving, or at least that's your perception. And when you get together with them and add up the figures that they quote, a lot of it's exaggeration, but it added up to 20, 30, 40, 50 billion dollars of claims that they had money at their access to that level of money. You'd have to be insane not to sit there and ask yourself, what does this mean? Well, I'm not saying it's evil, but you really wonder, what are the ramifications? What's the significance? Where did it come from?
And there's widespread anger, on both sides of the aisle, no matter what your political leanings are, about forced technology transfer, copycatting, Chinese copycatting of U.S. technology, which is another part of the problem and another part of what the Trump administration's seeming strategy is designed to combat.
Yeah, it's import substitution, high-tech industrialization on steroids. I mean, it's just so much money, so big. So the government role is so significant. It's not operating just on market principles at all. And that's what I think Ken is absolutely right, it has sparked this backlash. And by the way, the backlash is not just in the United States. First of all, it's not just Trump administration. It is politicians on both sides of the aisle, but it's also in Europe or South Korea or Japan. And in all of these countries, they are reviewing Chinese investment in technology much more stringently than in the past.
The funny thing to me, the ironic thing, is that the way that the Trump administration is beginning to think about governing technology and the digital economy is beginning to mirror our long-standing concerns about the Chinese system. So look at the executive order, which came out right before the entity list designation for Huawei. This gives the Commerce Department expansive authority to block any transaction by what's called a foreign adversary deemed a threat to national security in the digital economy. What is the digital economy, right? So this is not just about Huawei. This is any Chinese company deemed a national security threat. This is the very things we've been complaining about China's cybersecurity law and the black box national security reviews that foreign companies have to undergo to do business in China. We're doing it too.
Joy, is there a similar rising anti-US sentiment in China? Can you speak to that?
I don't live in China right now, so I don't necessarily feel that. I think just really from an economic perspective, there's huge impact of the current situation. And Sam mentioned Huawei, being put on the entity list. There's a third-party research. They have estimated if Huawei is banned from the 5G market in the U.S., it will shrink U.S. GDP by $241 billion over the next 6 years. That's a significant amount of money. So there's a huge economic impact for the U.S. and other countries as well.
Let me say something about the Chinese reaction. So I have spent a lot of time in China this year, and up until the time that the Trump administration put Huawei on the entity list and basically launched a tech embargo on China of our technology, our company's technologies going into Huawei and ZTE equipment. Many Chinese were actually rooting for the Trump administration tough stance toward China to counteract a lot of Chinese policies that they don't agree with of Xi Jinping. I mean, there are a lot of things about the way Xi Jinping is ruling China that people in the private sector, academics, many middle-class urbanites really don't like. And they were hoping that the market reforms that, of course, were launched back under Deng Xiaoping would be revived because of the pressure from outside China, because they see that under Xi Jinping, there are no checks and balances really on Xi's decision. I mean, it's a very autocratic and centralized system. So they're rooting for it, but I really think that this decision, this extreme decision to say that we could not, embargoing US technology in Huawei equipment, really there was no real justification for that on national security grounds. And it was there, and it's so costly to ourselves. Therefore, it's a symbol of unmitigated hostility toward China. It is kind of a declaration of war against China. And at that point, I think public opinion in China has become much more anti-American. They're rallying around the flag, rallying around the leader. And of course, the propaganda is reinforcing that. But I think a lot of it is really just genuine anger at, at American action that seems so hostile.
I would like to add one thing to what Susan's saying, and that is that I think that we're in a sense, if there's a war, it's a propaganda war, and we're losing the propaganda war in China. And I think it's less because of what we're doing and more because of how we're doing it. And I hearken back to one of my favorite presidents, Teddy Roosevelt, who said that you should speak softly and carry a big stick. I think that our President Trump speaks loudly and carries, increasingly, Chinese are beginning to think that his stick isn't very big at all.
All right, so I will we'll use that as a transition. We're going to have to wrap up the TV portion of this. I have one more question for Joy, and then a question for all of the panelists, and then we're going to open it up for questions. Thank you, Ken, for that colorful metaphor. Joy, speaking of the blacklisting, Huawei Google can no longer ship the latest version of its Android operating system to Huawei, and Huawei is now working on its own operating system. Mm-hmm. What's the progress on that, and can Huawei develop its own mobile operating system to rival Android, to rival Apple's iOS?
Well, like many global technology companies, Google, Microsoft, we all have our business continuity management process. So since 2008, IBM has been working with us. So we learned a lot of best practices in terms of business continuity. This is to deal with unexpected situations like natural disaster, earthquakes, tsunamis. And I think right now we're just, there are about 80,000 employees who are working really hard to find alternative solutions for different parts of the business. So in some businesses, we may cut off the non-core products, and in other situations, we may have to use our alternative solution, like a new operating system. I think the operating system is one aspect, but the entire ecosystem is very difficult to build. So we're confident if we have to adopt our own solution, over time, we'll be able to do that.
Okay, so last question for all of you. Where is the U.S.-China relationship in a year? Where is the U.S.-China relationship in 5 years? No matter how this plays out, is it possible to go back to the way things were? Or are we on a fundamentally new path that cannot be changed? Sam?
I think we're in uncharted territory now. And there's two scenarios that I see. One is going back to what I call the dysfunctional equilibrium of even a week ago, right? Where you have these simmering tensions that will just, maybe there's a deal on Huawei, maybe the currency thing goes away, Trump backs up, but these sort of tensions are going to come up in new forms. This is just one front of a wave that will continue. That said, US companies will continue to operate in China. You will have cross-border trade and investment, right? But it'll just be sort of simmering tension. The other is you go down a path where you do have a bifurcation, and I don't think it's going to be clear-cut because of the interconnection we've talked about, but you're going to be looking at it's not just going to be in US and China. What's going to happen in India, for example? You've got WeChat and Facebook and ByteDance, and you have a lot of different companies around the world that are going to be, competing for market share with maybe incompatible standards. And the whole way of thinking about supply chain efficiency, as Susan mentioned earlier, those are going to become vulnerabilities and points of leverage rather than efficiency gains.
I think that Xi Jinping could calm things down and maybe not go back to the status quo ante, but could stabilize the relationship with the United States if he demonstrated that he's a market reformer, that he actually believes in the market. Back in 2013, he had this great third plenum document that was filled with a lot of great words about continuing market reform and opening, and then none of it was ever carried out. So you don't have to do it in the context of a negotiation with a dysfunctional Trump administration that seems unable to negotiate anything specific in a very professional or effective way. Simply unilaterally go back to the the third plenum in 2013 and actually do these things. Do some things in the South China Sea. You know, have that code of conduct be binding, accelerate it, reassure other countries about your international intentions. I mean, China is going to be ambitious. That's inevitable. But there are so many ways that it could pursue its ambitions in a way that is not viewed as threatening to other countries, but goes back to the Deng Xiaoping approach of really trying to reassure other countries. I mean, China benefited so much from integrating in the global economy and global governance institutions. I mean, if they really got back, you know, if Deng Xiaoping were here, I'm sure that's what he'd be telling them to do.
Joy, where is the U.S.-China relationship in a year,
Well,
5 years, and can we
It
go
will be
back?
very hard to say. I think, you know, from a Huawei perspective, we definitely want the U.S. government to clarify our status and then clarify the status for our U.S. suppliers as well.
Now, Ken, before you answer, are tariffs not a big enough stick? Do tariffs not make the stick big enough?
No, they don't, and it's the wrong stick anyway, in my opinion. Can I answer now?
Yes, you can.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that that it's highly dependent on who is in which position of leadership where, because none of these things are static. Even in China, where we have a leader apparently for life now, life can't last forever. And so I think it really depends on, leaders are the ones that make a difference, generally speaking. Obviously, systems perpetuate themselves, but leaders change systems. So it really depends on who's president in another, I'm hoping 2 years, but maybe 6 years. It's also a question of what happens to the Xi Jinping administration, how long it's there. And that's the only way that we can answer this, is by speculating as to who the leaders were. But looking at China now for a minute, I do not, nobody can convince me right now that Xi Jinping is a market reformer. There's a difference between rhetoric and action, and the rhetoric's one thing, but the action is quite another. And I also think that he lacks what I consider to be the clever modesty of Deng Xiaoping, and that the lack of Deng Xiaoping's clever modesty is creating at an emotional level a response which isn't fortuitous for either country. But finally, it also depends on what other countries think, because increasingly, countries around the world, I think, in my opinion, are getting fed up with our approach and, frankly, with China's approach. And there are countries that are in a position to play a greater leadership role themselves over time. And I think that they may change the balance, and the influence may begin emanating from other quarters.
All right. An open question as to how the war, or not quite war, will end. Sam Sachs, Susan Shirk, Joy Tan, Ken Wilcox, thank you all for joining us. All right, now it's your turn.
Thank you, Emily. Thank you, panel. So we'll have 15, 20 minutes for Q&A, not just Q&A. I mean, please feel free to pass along your own comments as well. The cameras will be rolling, so if you could, when you stand up, introduce yourself, your name, and your company affiliation. Since I'm the editorial director, I get to ask the first question. We've heard a lot of very sensible advice on what the US should do to head off this coming tech Cold War. Ken, you spoke about, you said America should embrace Chinese researchers and scientists more warmly. We've heard about the small yard, high wall concept, which is very, very sensible. I sort of have been watching this from the other side of the Silicon Curtain. I lived in China for the last 20 years and have been watching the hostility, and you talk about the hostility towards Huawei and this sort of almost an open declaration of war. I've seen a lot of hostility from the Chinese side too. The exclusion of all of the big American social media platforms. I ran the Wall Street Journal's Chinese language and English edition, which was summarily closed down, along with almost all Western media in China. The squeezing of American tech companies, the increasing push that the Chinese have towards technology self-reliance, culminating in this Made in China 2025 program. So my question is this, and I know, Susan, you've talked about what Xi Jinping should do and go back to the third plenum and stop building islands in the South China Sea. I'm just wondering if we could go very quickly down the panel, specifically, what practical steps, measures could Xi Jinping, could the Chinese administration take now to really change the atmosphere and head off this looming conflict?
I started the first one last time. I'm going to start at this side now.
Well, go ahead.
Oh, I think 2 or 3 things. One of them is dismantle the islands in the South China Sea. I know that's not probable, but I think it would have an amazingly positive effect. I think maintaining them is, from a military perspective, of very little use anyway. They're purely symbolic and in an annoying way. And actually introduce market reform. I'm skeptical that he has any interest in that, but there's a huge difference between rhetoric and action, and ultimately only action will carry the day. So those would be the 2 suggestions.
So, well, okay, so I was in China when Facebook and Twitter got shut down, when Google left the country, doing stand-ups at Tiananmen Square. China has shut out many U.S. companies, many U.S. technology companies. Why shouldn't the U.S. do the same? What can the Chinese do to help us?
So there have been a slew of cybersecurity regulations that have come out even in just the last few weeks. These are the regulatory tools that make it so tough for companies, or impossible.
Wait,
Chinese regulation that make it so tough on the ground to get the licenses needed to operate. You know, right after the entity list announcement, China released an updated draft of the cybersecurity review measures. This is a black box security review that at any time can be used to shut down a company in China, right? This is just one of dozens and dozens. So absolutely, there are a number of ways that the playing field can and should be levelized.
Well, why can't we negotiate some of these things? I mean, under the principle of reciprocity. Now, admittedly, the U.S. is this very open economy. China started out as a centrally planned economy. So, but they had been converging, or China was converging more toward market norms. So some of these things, you know, could be negotiated.
And it wouldn't be so difficult in the sense that we talk a lot about China as this monolithic entity where every Chinese company is sort of viewed as an arm of the Politburo. And the reality is, particularly in the tech space, these are private companies, and we can argue, does private exist in China or not? I would say it does. The tech sector is being led by private sector actors, a lot of them with foreign investment money, that are probably more concerned about their own government getting in their way of their commercial ambitions, right? And this is not just Huawei, but think about the Alibabas and the ByteDances, the ones that are really going out and trying to fulfill Xi Jinping's vision of being a sort of having big and strong Chinese internet companies competing around the world. Yeah. Let them compete. Let them be global commercial companies.
It just seems like some of these things are non-negotiable for the Chinese government.
No,
they're not
some
are,
for US sure.
Companies operate according to our social norm, freedom of speech.
Yeah, and control, censorship, control over content is not something that you're going to see a lot of give on. I mean, I remember when in negotiating China's accession to the WTO, you know, I was part of the team with Charlene Barshevsky, and it was just striking to me how the whole cultural area was the most tightly controlled. And, you know, within the Chinese Communist Party, the propaganda shitong propaganda bureaucracy is so powerful, you know. But I think I don't think it's entirely hopeless that and maybe not in internet companies, but in other sectors. China could move ahead. Remember, we were negotiating a bilateral investment treaty. The Trump administration abandoned the effort. But if China unilaterally or in negotiation with us opened up practically every sector except for a small handful of sectors that are related to national security or maybe the cultural areas, and just said, okay, you know, foreign companies come in and compete on the basis of national treatment, everybody gets treated the same, you know, it would be pretty dramatic gesture.
So small yard, high fence in China.
Exactly.
Joy, can you
point.
think of any advice that you might give the Chinese government that would make your life, things that they could do that would make your life easier?
Well, I will agree with some of them. Definitely in China, I would love to use Google Maps. I would love to use Facebook and some of the social media platforms too. Yeah.
With a VPN.
Well,
Oh, you would like to?
I would
okay,
like to,
you would
yeah,
like to.
yeah.
Okay, good to know.
Carson.
Thanks, Andy. My name is Carson Kahn. I formerly CEO at a Silicon Valley Bank-backed AI startup called Volley.com, and I am joining this session from a Bloomberg New Economy Forum working group on responsible AI. So I think a lot about how advancements in AI get funded. And Susan and Ken, you both touched on the flight of venture capital dollars originating from China after its boom in 2015, where now we see almost none of it. Well, when you track those dollars, we see they're going to India. And despite our alliant relationship here in the US with India, it's arguably our other major emergent competitor. So looking at the first or second order consequences, it's what I would call a paradoxical effect. And I thought I'd ask each of you, what do you see as the most important, maybe injurious, paradoxical effects of this tech Cold War we have going on right now, and how can we maybe avoid some of that history replaying itself?
Ken?
Well, first of all, I am a firm believer that over the long haul, collaboration works better than a defensive posture will ever work. I don't think, to say what I said before, I don't think that you can contain ideas, and I don't think that you can contain advancements in AI. I think that's virtually impossible. So it's much, much better to encourage Chinese investment, in my opinion, and ensure collaboration so that we benefit on both sides. And you know, to the extent that there is anything that constitutes illegal activity or espionage, we just have to do a better job of identifying it and working to prevent it. But we should also go out of our way to make sure that we're not associating it with a specific ethnicity, because that's always counterproductive.
I think there may be some other countries other than India that will be the beneficiaries. Certainly Vietnam, Mexico. I think Mexico is going to be a big beneficiary of the, the sort of recasting of the supply chains. And, so out of bad things, some good things can happen. Another thing that might happen, although don't hold your breath, is that we might actually improve our primary and secondary education, especially in STEM fields, so that we have talent here in America who can go into these university laboratories and make progress. I am very much opposed to trying to exclude Chinese talent. But I think it is important that not all of our talent be educated abroad. One of my friends from Europe was telling me the Europeans have a lot of complaints because They have pretty good primary and secondary education. Their universities are really not very good. So all of those students just come here to America, you know, to university and graduate school. And meanwhile, they have invested in primary and secondary education, and we haven't.
All right.
Thank you. Wonderful panel discussion. My name is Yabo Len. I'm on the board of the ESSA Society, North California Bay Area Council. I wanted to ask a question to you, Susan. If you were advising the president right now regarding WTO, number one, do you think the Chinese accession to WTO that you and Ambassador Selin Basovsky did such a great job on has been a success, net? And the current administration has been advocating that allowing China to become a member of WTO has been a mistake. So what would you tell the president at this point?
Well, you know, I definitely believe that negotiating China's accession to the WTO was a smart thing for the United States. I mean, our tariffs were already low. You know, our economy was open. We were able to open up Chinese sectors, reduce Chinese tariffs, and that's been promoted China's integration with, look, China has more trading partners in the world than the United States does. So it's, now, if you think that China ruled by Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party is inherently an evil, threatening monster, as Janos Kornoy, the Hungarian economist, who was very instrumental in advising China's market reformers, recently said, I'm not sure I did a good thing because I created a monster. And I actually know some Chinese economists who think, did we really do a good thing for the world to make China so much more capable, because the way the system operates now is really incompatible with a peaceful relationship with other countries. So there are those questions, and I take them seriously. But I think, you know, it definitely would have been worse. Remember what Richard Nixon said about leaving China outside the community of nations to nature its hurts and resentments. Would that have been better? Should Nixon have never gone to China so that we could have kept China poor and weak forever? As if we could actually do that.
Thank you. Paul.
Great panel. I'm Paul Triolo from the Eurasia Group, and we have clients on all sides of this issue. I think one really critical piece of the equation that hasn't come up yet is in this decoupling discussion. We've talked about supply chains and students and researchers, but I think data is a big issue that we grapple with on a day-to-day basis as the world develops new best practices around data in Europe and in Asia. And I wonder if Sam, in particular, can answer where do we see China on this continuum? Because in the negotiations that broke down in May, for example, the issue of China's place in the data firmament, if you will, was beginning to come up as they discussed things like cloud services and how U.S. companies could get licenses in China, and the broader issue of how does China fit into the data system, you know, around the world, and was beginning to come up. And Chinese companies are operating globally now in Europe, like Alibaba, Huawei, other companies. And so I think data and sort of the future of cross-border data flows and how these are going to be regulated and how China, as a huge player in this, fits into into global regimes is really critical. And so if the decoupling goes into data, then I think we're in a whole new world. So I'd like to love your thoughts on the data issue.
Thank you very much for the question, Paul. I think that data and data governance, so how governments interact with the private sector when it comes to data, is going to be probably at the center of this growing US-China technology competition, right? Because data fuels AI development, there are cross-border transactions, there are questions around law enforcement access to data, right? So we're at an inflection point, and I think that we may be going in a path of what I would call data spheres of influence, where the US has traditionally had free flows of data across borders, whereas China, India are putting in place restrictions on certain kinds of data that has to be stored on servers in country, and companies have to undergo very arduous security assessments before that data transfers out. I think the US might be moving towards thinking about restrictions of data, in their own right. I mean, we saw the unwinding of the Grindr acquisition by a Chinese gaming company on the basis that if Grindr data gets into the hands of the Chinese government, that could be used as a tool of blackmail. Prime Minister Abe in Japan is thinking about ways to sort of create data free flows with certain safeguards in it. The question is, who would be a sort of like-minded country that could be part of such a scheme? Could we end up in a world where maybe the US, Europe, and Japan are trading data with each other, but Chinese AI companies don't have access to that data? So is data increasingly going to be weaponized? And I think, going back to the earlier question about a sort of another third-order consequence of this, I think that data flows is certainly going to be one, and there are repercussions for the development of new technologies, all across the scope. So let's definitely focus on that. So thank you for the question.
We have a lot of questions to get through, so quick questions and quick answers.
Andy Rothman from Matthews Asia. Will you indulge me with 2 quick questions?
Okay. Is it you, Andy?
First is very narrow for Sam. The Trump administration has made a big deal about forced technology. Could you talk about whether that's a big problem, and if it is, what the solution would be? And then for the whole panel, there seems to be a prevailing wisdom in Washington that 40 years of engagement between the US and China has failed to produce any change in China, and that motivates a lot of the reasons for moving to a more confrontational approach. I'd love to hear your thoughts on whether you agree with that engagement has failed.
Forced technology transfer has been an issue for decades. I think the focus of the Trump administration has been a bit off on that. So there's a lot of attention paid to things like joint ventures, and certainly that's an area where it's been a problem for years. But I mentioned before the sort of suite, the dozens of cybersecurity regulations and standards, and I think that's an area where technology transfer is also an issue. If you think about the sort of standards required for US companies to be certified by in order to do business in China, and their very invasive reviews of their technology and IP that go on in order to comply with certain standards, I think that's something that is a problem. You also, though, have sort of incentives from Chinese companies that are not just copying anymore, right? They are innovating in their own right. So there's this misconception that innovation only flows one way across the Pacific, and that's changing. Now it's going both ways, and US companies realize if they want to be on the cutting edge of some of these technologies, they have to be in China, because a lot of the cutting edge work in areas like AI and mobile communications and smart cities, like this is happening in China. So the forced technology transfer conversation, I think, is missing a lot of those dynamics.
Engagement.
Engagement, is it dead?
Yes. Engagement is, we need to engage China, but engagement as the grand strategy is over, and we're not going to get back to that. Did it fail to produce any positive changes in China? No. People have very short memories. One good thing about being an old China hand, I have a long memory. And I remember China, I first went to China in the Mao era. And the market reforms that were introduced in the late 70s and throughout the 80s, 90s, 2000s, basically until the second term of Hu Jintao, 2008, 2009, there was a lot of progress in China in terms of liberalizing political controls over society. I mean, of course, not democracy. I don't think anybody expected democratization. But certainly for Chinese citizens, it was a much better place to live than it had been during the Mao era. So, and I think that US encouragement of those reforms and a kind of spirit of goodwill in welcoming China into global institutions, et cetera, creation of the G20, all of those things created a good international environment for that kind of progress in China. So it was underway until it wasn't. And it's not all Xi Jinping. It started earlier than Xi Jinping, but Xi Jinping has definitely made things worse.
Joy, from where you sit, do you think engagement is over? Can you imagine a time when Huawei may be embraced by this country? If so, how would America have to change and how would Huawei have to change?
Well, I don't think the engagement is over. I think both countries benefited greatly by working together. I think we definitely hope to see that continue going forward. We definitely want to work with the U.S. government to find out the mechanism that will make them less concerned about Huawei, because this is a technology issue. I mean, there are proven mechanisms that can work. So we definitely want to continue to work with the government. I mean, there's so many rural operators in this country. They rely on Huawei for providing basic broadband services to the consumers in Montana, in East Oregon. So we don't want to see that digital divide in the rural communities continue. So definitely, we certainly hope Huawei can be embraced by the U.S. The economic benefit and for the U.S. economy and for countries around the world.
Maybe we'll go to another question. Maybe you could field this one.
So, Marcia Vandenberg, and I wear multiple hats, including sitting on the board of a corporate company, and one in Singapore and one in India. And Ken, you quoted Teddy Roosevelt, and it made me think of FDR and what he said around December 7th, and that was Americans have to fear is fear itself, and Americans would do well to be reminded of that. Susan talked about engagement being over, and perhaps it's engagement as we have known it. But if that's the case, what does it mean for the rules-setting regimens in the world around the internet, for instance, the concerns around the balkanization of the internet and how that process proceeds?
Ken, would you like to have a go at that?
I'll take a quick shot. I'm with Susan and anybody else up here who believes that engagement is the only answer. I think if Joy were the paramount leader, that we would have better luck at engagement, by the way. But I think that engagement only works if we take the right approach. And that is, I think we have to understand that, at least to the extent that we're dealing with the current administration in China, and maybe earlier administrations as well, that we have to have leverage. It's not yelling, it's not drama, it's not appeals to fairness, it's leverage. And as far as I can tell, our administration doesn't seem to recognize that, because I can't figure out where their leverage is. And until they can identify their leverage, they might as well quit yelling.
Isn't Huawei the leverage that they think they have?
Yeah, but I'm not sure that they have leverage with Huawei. At least I wouldn't depend on on that if I were in charge. And the other aspect is we have to take a bilateral or multilateral approach. Trying to do this all by ourselves is not going to get there, because the current administration in China will look at us and gauge our strength and our leverage and dismiss us.
Well, that's related to this question about trying to find international cooperative solutions. New regimes, reforming the WTO, reforming the existing regimes, but trying to develop some new agreements that would reduce the tensions that now exist between the U.S. and China on these issues.
We have time for two more quick questions, one here and then the final one over here. Sorry.
Edith Young, Proof of Capital, and spent half of my time in China, half of my time in Silicon Valley. I really would love to hear you guys' thought just on one premise is that from a technology side of things, I think a lot of young Chinese people actually really admire the US, in particular Silicon Valley, right? If you look at most of the IPOs that's been happening for Chinese companies actually happen on NASDAQ and New York Stock Exchange. So there's a lot of appreciation. But since we're talking about data privacy, we obviously learned about Cambridge Analytica. We know that U.S. government obviously have access to a lot of data, particularly Facebook and Google. If you guys would advise both U.S. government and Chinese government in terms of what will be sort of at least like a framework, as you mentioned earlier, instead of hard rule, because obviously both sides have done good thing, bad things, but there's a lot of goodwill, I have to say, on the Asia side. Been looking at the U.S., also feel both sides need to improve too. So how do we actually solve that? We'd love to hear your thoughts.
On the data privacy issue, I think that both China and the US have a big problem with data ownership. There's a significant backlash against US company access to data in the US. I think that there is a lot of, the Chinese government has expansive tools to access data from its own companies. The Chinese government is moving pretty fast to put in place new rules around data protection. A lot of them are focused on companies, not the government. The US we're having our own debate about what federal data privacy law should look like. So I think this is an area that, China, the US, Europe, China actually modeled its data protection regime after GDPR. These systems are not evolving in a vacuum. They're happening in reference to one another, and that's something that I think needs to be talked about more.
Yeah, I will agree. GDPR is a good standard to follow. Yeah.
Well, final question. I'm afraid the rules are really rigged today. Final question goes to my Bloomberg opinion colleague, Shiro.
Thank you. Yeah, totally rigged. So this is sort of a yes or no question, I think, for each of you. So in, let's say, 3 or 4 years, what are the odds that the status quo continues, that the U.S. and Chinese tech sectors, particularly in areas like software and AI and the internet and telecom networks, they continue to operate in more or less parallel spheres, but parallel but not overlapping spheres? What are the odds that that continues in 3 or 4 years?
Ken?
100%. They'll continue to operate in parallel without significant improvement in terms of overlap, in my opinion, because I don't see any change in leadership in the near term on either side, and I believe that things will continue as they have been until there are changes in leadership.
Joy?
I will agree, yeah.
I think that's the most likely.
Agree.
That was a short answer. Thank you. So look, thank you very much indeed to our moderator, Emily, to our brilliant panel, and our amazing audience. Thank you for helping us further our new economy agenda, and I believe the Asia Society agenda, which is to have these high-level, intelligent discussions on critical issues of the day, ultimately aimed at driving forward solutions. Thank you very much. We have drinks outside. Unfortunately, drinking time is down now to half an hour. We've more or less closed the bar at 6 o'clock, but please stick around and continue the conversation. Thank you.
Not to take the last word, but I'm going to do one more thank you for TV purposes, if you don't mind. Do you? No.
Oh.
I'm mic'd. All right. And with that, I would like to thank our panelists. Thank you so much. Sam Sachs, Susan Shirk, Joy Tan, Ken Wilcox. Thank you so much for this conversation today.
Thank you, Emily.
Thank you.
Good job.
Thank you.
Good job. Super interesting. You did a great job.
Thank you. Thank you.
Very impressed.
Thank you.
Yeah, she did. You have a very well.
Yeah.
Well, SoftBank Group is set to report earnings after the close in Tokyo later on. Net profit expected to more than double from a year ago. Asia Tech reporter Pavel Apelyev is watching this. So, Pavel, what should we expect from the first quarter?
Good morning. In terms of actual numbers, I think net income is a fairly clear story. We expect SoftBank to book the one-time gain from the sale of Alibaba stake. It's been a complex transaction that lasted about 3 years that involved derivatives, and unwinding of those derivatives is likely to land in a quarter, potentially bumping their profit by as much as 1.2 trillion yen. Now, the operating profit is always a little bit more unpredictable. The Vision Fund is kind of in a driving seat when it comes to the OP. In this quarter, in the past quarter, I think the IPO of Slack is a potential positive, but year on year, it's possible that the profit will decline. Now, more than the actual numbers, I think people would really want to hear what Son has to say, and there's lots of things going on, and not least of them is the creation of the second Vision Fund, around which there's still a lot of questions.
Yeah, let's talk about that second Vision Fund. What do analysts want to hear from Masayoshi Son?
Right now, we only know the broad sketches. We know that it's going to be 108 billion yen, that SoftBank will contribute 38 billion, which sounds like it puts them in the position of the biggest contributor. It's quite a contrast from the first fund, where 45 billion came from Saudi Arabia, and the Saudis were the owner investment committee, and by a lot of people, they were seen as a kind of a counterweight to Masayoshi Son's authority. So one thing people wouldn't know is will Son be completely in charge? Whether there'll be other shareholders, and for SoftBank investors themselves, it'd be actually really interesting to find out how Son plans to pay for that 38 billion contribution to the second fund.
And Pavel, Sprint nearing that approval of its merger with T-Mobile. Could we be hearing anything about that?
That's right. It would be quite a big event for SoftBank when it does happen. Now, while it received the DOJ approval and FCC has been very positive about it, it's still working its way through the courts, because just last week, Texas joined about a dozen of states who are challenging it on antitrust basis. One thing that some might